racial landscape, where groups seek to escape the racist imperial gaze of American society and seek to escape the racial policies of the state. And being anti-Muslim is a way of claiming one's sense of Americanness. So this claim of racial or religious misrecognition, in my view, misses certain opportunities for the condemnation of the violence as in general. That if I were to talk about this in class, in terms of identity politics, again, the recognition of these individuals as Sikhs, not as Muslims. And we can think about identity politics in terms of politics based on identities. And some of my students here hear this ad nauseum, but identity politics, politics based on identities, that views political interests that must be based on a single conception of identity. So a single conception of identity as Sikhs or as Asian Americans then shapes your political response to something. But rather to think more in terms of identities based on politics. So to be open to the formation of broader solidarities that may transcend particular racial or religious identities. So an organization such as MESA has sought to create these types of coalitions, these broader coalitions involving the shared project of resisting Orientalism, of resisting of imperialism, and to situate these kind of conflicts within larger global politics rather than just national or ethnic politics. So I know we're short on time, so I'm going to end there. So I would emphasize, again, as Professor Mann says, that this is not a particularly Sikh issue or an Asian American issue, but rather it's an issue that involves all of us, and we're all in it together. Thank you.
Thank you all for setting the stage, and now the floor is yours, and I invite all of you to raise one by one, not all together, obviously, so to ask questions of the panel, and if you just raise your hand, I'll call on you. Please speak clearly and loudly so that the panelists can hear you. We don't have a mics. Yes.
Professor, I have a question about identity politics. It's not entirely based on ethnical politics, or just vote for your own race, or vote together as a race. What do you define as identity politics?
Identity politics?
Yeah.
Well, I think the typical conception is, again, the politics based on identities, the views that political interests are based on a single conception of an identity, so that your identity as a Sikh or as an Asian American is going to shape your politics, correct? And that's a limited way of looking at politics, in my view. I mean, I'm in an Asian American Studies department, and maybe it's counterintuitive, but to me that leads to a dead end in terms of political action. But so rather to think more in terms of identities based on politics, so that we don't have a preconceived notion of what it means to be Asian American that defines your politics, but rather these identities are constantly in flux, and that it doesn't preclude the possibility for different types of coalitions, so that as an Asian American, I can build coalitions with other groups. I hope that addresses it.
This question is directed towards Dr. Shin. I was wondering if you could speak to whether it would be possible to have legal reform in a sense to sort of include Sikhs to be more included in society so that they'd be more protected, or whether that was even a necessary step with the laws that we have at this point. Do we need legal reform, or do the laws that we have now protect us?
The laws on the books are pretty good. The laws on the books prohibit discrimination in employment and with regard to the purchase and sale of property. They prohibit discrimination on a wide variety of grounds, in many cases by both public and private actors. And the problem is something like school segregation or discrimination in employment. You know, we had great court decisions in the 50s and wonderful laws on the books starting in the mid-60s. But what actually happened? Certainly, the mere fact that there were laws on the books did not end school segregation or race discrimination in employment. So at this point, I don't think it's a question of that we need more laws. I think it's a question both that we need to enforce those laws more vigorously, and that is a question of what the federal and state governments are willing to do. But also, I think, about educating, communicating with the public at large that a lot of these various groups of people of color are not dangerous and harmful. You know, they're just Americans like everybody else. But I don't think that everybody accepts that. I don't think that overt racism is a mainstream public value anymore. But I also don't think that in the privacy of office managers and decision makers that they're always free of racial prejudice.
Just on a related note, I remember reading a blog after the shooting, and one of the sons of the women who were killed sought to pass a resolution, a state resolution, and he had found that the FBI, the Department of Justice, in tracking hate crimes, does not actually count specific anti-Sikh crimes, but rather collapses it under this larger rubric of anti-Muslim hate crimes. And so it just poses the question again, what kind of decisions are we going to make? What kind of coalition politics are we going to engage in to address these larger issues?
So I know a number of you talked about this, but Professor Mann, what is your opinion on South Asian representatives on like the political or economic or social scene that choose to abandon their South Asian identity in order to participate in politics? And I know like within the last 10 years, there's been a number of politicians that have done this. Do you think it's a necessary evil, or is it something that it should be looked down upon?
Are we thinking of Nikki Haley and Bobby Jindal? This is a hard question for me to answer. I think that's their position. But I can give you a quick personal response. That was in connection with Nikki Haley. Stephen Prathro, Boston University professor, used to write CNN blog, but he continues that. So he called me at some point about Nikki Haley, and I said, look, I mean, Jats are political people, and they will do whatever needs to be done, and that's all what I can say. I don't know the details of Nikki Haley's, politics, Republican politics, but that is the way. These are personal decisions. Well, if you saw her at the Republican convention, she came up and she didn't seem to deny her South Asian heritage. She talked about her parents and how they came here and all that. But I see your point that it's these are hard personal decisions people have in that.
I'd say it's like symptomatic though, right? So the more it tells us what kind of Sikhs we have to be in order to be successful in politics. And then what kind of Sikhs you have to be successful in the world today. What kind of identity is allowable, right? And it's kind of like very symptomatic of like larger problems within secularism and its kind of combatant nature with the religious in many ways.
I have a question for Dr. Chang. Pardon my ignorance, that's actually kind of two parts, if that's okay. The first part is kind of like case law pertaining to immigration, because like you astutely observed, despite the laws on books today being, anti-racist, it still goes on. So I'm wondering kind of like what's the immigration law like today?
the Supreme Court has made it harder and harder over the years to successfully sue on the grounds that you've been discriminated against in employment. There are occasional wins. I mean, it's not that no one ever wins. It's just that it's very hard to win, and the courts seem to bend over backwards to accept explanations by employers that even when they use racial slurs or gender-based slurs, even when there's clear bad things going on, courts sort of say, well, this doesn't seem, just because you call there's a famous series of cases where the employer calls an African-American male employee boy, and repeatedly, and nobody else, and the court says, who knows what they meant by that? That probably is not meant as an insult, which just seems preposterous to me. In terms of the way, the fact that the constitutional law of the United States dealing with immigration arose in race cases, it arose in cases involving Chinese, Japanese, Indians, still has pervasive effects today. The law on the books doesn't discriminate against these groups anymore. But the cases say that the government could discriminate against these groups whenever it wants. There was a case where the Supreme Court decided that if Congress wants to expel people on the basis of race, it can. And that's still the law today. So they could do that. But more fundamentally, the rights that one has, the procedural rights that a person being deported has, were all established in cases involving Asians. And so the law is structured to say, basically, you get very minimal rights. And if you're at the border and a Customs and Border Protection officer doesn't like to look at your visa, in many instances they can just turn you around and send you away based on these Supreme Court cases, and there's very little that can be done about it. And another thing that's very clear, and I'm working on a paper on this now, is that in the 20s and 30s, when the immigrant stream was almost all white, there were 1,000,001 ways to avoid being deported. There were all kinds of relief measures, and you could be convicted of armed robbery, but the judge could say you don't have to be deported. And many of these relief measures explicitly said they were unavailable to aliens ineligible to citizenship. And over time, as the immigrant stream has become more and more diverse, and since the 1965 Act, it's been a supermajority of Latinos and Asians and Africans, and a very small number of traditional Caucasians. All of those relief measures have been cut back or eliminated. And so when it was a white immigrant stream, these people, the alien is flesh of our flesh and blood of our blood, and so we're not going to be unreasonably harsh on them. And now, it's strictly a business transaction, and if an alien, a non-citizen, crosses over the line, well, you broke the rules, you gotta go.
I have a question for Dr. Mann. This came up in the lunch today about how there was a certain notion of dividing identity or history among the Punjabi Sikh, the Punjabi Hindu, and the Punjabi Muslim community, of how there's this notion of this idea that you can separate these identities, or you can separate the histories of these communities. And we had this discussion during lunch, but I just wanted to get your thoughts on what you felt what was your kind of stance on this, I guess you can say, movement almost, towards this idea that there is this separable, distinct Punjabi identity and Sikh identity that can or cannot be intertwined?
It's a large question, but let me try to address it. So the first, what is the scholarly position on these issues? The sort of the received wisdom would be that before the coming of the British, these groups had much closer interaction and the boundaries were not sharply drawn. And then they came, I think, with divide and rule issue comes up, that the British are responsible for these identities. My work or my readings of the early sources doesn't really support that position. Yes, the boundaries were sharpened because the issues at stake were different. But before the coming of the British, these communities saw themselves as distinct religious communities with distinct political visions, etc., etc. But nonetheless, as we were talking about, just not one identity at a time. There are Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs, but they are all Punjabis. Now the issue would be that Punjabis versus the Biharis. I think, it's again, this indigenous sort of sources are yet to be brought into discussion. One of the reasons why the Sikh army is sort of devastated that they were defeated by the Purbiyas, people from Bihar and Bengal. If they were to be defeated by the Afghans, it's a fair game. We thrashed them for 30 years, now this is their turn. But the literature of that period would bring in, nobody's really concerned about the British, because the facts are that the number of Britishers in India has always remained very small. They brought the subcontinent under control with the help of the local people. So how did the Sikhs get defeated? By the Biharis. And then there is the Punjabi identity comes in. Yes, the Sikh army, it's Ranjit Singh's kingdom. But who fought in that war? Muslims fought. As I was sort of talking to you about, I think I did raise that at lunchtime, that artillery in Ranjit Singh's army was exclusively Muslim. So in a way, Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs are fighting against the British army. So in some, I think, important ways, all these things are working simultaneously, and it becomes hard when we try to somehow compartmentalize them and say, well, this is this. Yes, we are simultaneously Sikh and Punjabi. And the same thing would be, and sort of quick, example would be that when a Punjabi Hindu family moves to Delhi, they quickly adopt to speaking Hindi. But a Sikh family would take much longer. They will try to sort of stick on, but then sort of the other side of the coin is that the Sikhs begin to think that Punjabi is their language. And that doesn't help either. But all these components have to be somehow understood, separated, to understand the situation, but then also be, sensitive to the fact that they are working together. Does that help?
Thank you.
I just want to add on to that is that the identity of being Punjabi, it's a true fact that there are more Punjabi-speaking people in Pakistan than there are Indian, and majority of them are Muslim, and they use a different alphabet to write Punjabi also. But the identity politics, or the way to identify themselves as Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims, despite everything that happened in the past 50, 100, 150 years, and the notion that British tried to divide and rule, I grew up in India, I studied history over there. I never saw an example of divide and rule over there. It was more like the British employed. It's always like, oh, British tried to divide Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs. Never really saw that, except that these people divided themselves to further take their agendas ahead.
I would agree. I would agree with you. I'm not saying that the British divided and conquered. I'm saying that there was a new notion of subjectivity that allowed for communities to divide themselves, right?
And
I think it's important distinction.
Even these days, there's not that much division besides divide, despite all the political rhetoric there is. There's not much division between growing up in a village. I see that there's not that much division among people. Hindus go to gurdwaras, and we respect their beliefs. Like my neighbors need some space to hold a function overnight, and we let them use our space. Like, all right, it's okay if you want to use our space to hold function overnight. There's no animosity, there's no enmity between them. The problem is that the politics, despite the whole division, the politics is the one that's dividing them. It's they themselves, and the way, and I'm sorry I disagree with you, but Sikhs did not think Punjabi is an own language. Sikhs did not come up with that conclusion, or with that. It was forced upon them, that it was forced upon Hindus, that Punjabi is not your language. And when we asked for Punjab, we didn't ask for a Sikh homeland technically, we were asking for a Punjabi state. We're not asking for a Sikh state. To this day, it was named the Punjabi State Movement. It was never a Sikh state movement. It was a Punjabi Suba Lehar. That means translated the Punjabi State Movement, not necessarily a Sikh Suba Lehar. It was not. They were never asking that there should be a Sikh majority. They were asking.
Okay, let's let the panel respond.
The issue is a little more complicated than that. That Sikhs want a Sikh majority state, and asking for Punjabi Suba is the only way to somehow demand that, because nobody is going to give you a Sikh state. You would look pretty stupid given the whole situation. So in